Hello, welcome to the MuseScore Café for today, February 13th, 2019. And today, the topic that I wanted to talk about is our awesome tips and tricks for getting the most out of MuseScore. And this is something I've been kind of refining over the last few, weeks. Looks like I'm giving you my whole face, aren't I? That's lovely. But let's switch. There we go. Okay. Let me just focus a little better. Okay. So I've been giving some presentations and talking to people and discovering things that I really already knew from teaching MuseScore is that there's certain things that people tend to not figure out for themselves. And so I've kind of put together a little top 10 list of the things that I think most people are missing. I mean, a lot of people figure these things out or read the manuals and get them from there, but these are the things that I think you're most likely to miss out on if you haven't really checked out the manual. So first of all, let me make sure I get back to where the chat is and pop this thing out so I can be looking. Hello, everyone. So I will switch over here. Okay, there we go. And so I will definitely take, if you guys have your own favorite tricks, I'm going to try to make note of those. In fact, hold on one second. Now just, they'll be in the chat. I don't need to write. Who needs to write pen and paper? But I do have pen and paper notes for myself because I'm that kind of guy. All right, so I said I put together like a little top 10 list of the things that I think people, especially people who are relatively new, are just sort of finding their way around. These are the things you're most likely to miss out on, and I would love to be able to help you be a little more efficient in using MuseScore. So, number one on my list is navigation. I think people look at MuseScore here as it starts up and see, oh, there's no scroll bars. How can I see the rest of my score? And one of the first things that people manage to figure out is that if you click in the score, that's interesting that it says right click. I didn't right click. I guess long tap is right click on my computer. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I never even knew that. Wow. Oh, wow. If I click, check that out. I think it's about where I click. I don't know. Right click. I'm clicking the right side of my touchpad, and it's a right click. I never knew that. Okay. Anyhow, if I click and drag, or in my case, double tap and drag, which is what I usually do, you can move the score around. And people manage to figure that out. Or a mouse, you click and drag. That's fine, but it's not very efficient, and it's actually kind of difficult because if you've got some actual notes in your score, there's a pretty good chance that when you start dragging things, you're eventually gonna drag a lyric like I just did, or drag a note, or drag something you didn't mean to drag. So dragging the score around is not the way to do things. The best way of moving around, I think, is to use the scroll wheel on your mouse, if you have an actual mouse with a scroll wheel. A lot of us are using laptops. I haven't used a mouse in a long time, really, but on my touchpad, 2-finger swipe up and down scrolls, and it scrolls up and down. Now on my touchpad, 2-finger swipe sideways also scrolls sideways. A lot of touchpads don't have that feature, but Shift plus 2-finger scroll up and down will scroll sideways. So that's a way of scrolling through your score quickly, is 2-finger swipe up, down, or sideways, or Shift plus 2-finger swipe up, down. Those are the ways I normally move around my score if I'm just, moving short distances. There's also the page up, page down commands. Page up moves a page at a time. Page down moves down a page at a time, and so forth. So those key commands, and if you don't have actual physical page up and page down keys on your keyboard, usually there's some shortcut like FN plus up arrow will be page up, or FN plus down arrow to be page down. Similarly, FN plus left is usually the home button. If you don't have a home button, that goes to the beginning of your score. FN plus end goes to the last page of the score. The end key, or FN plus right arrow. So those are some of the ways of moving around in your score. One of the other things that you want to be aware of is, here's page view. If I switch to continue, well, let me actually use the zoom command while I'm at it. I'm going to zoom out so you can see a little more of what's happening. So the pages of my score are laid out left to right here, and as I hit the end of one page, it's going to have to go up to the beginning of the next. If you want to just see everything in one big strip, switch to continuous view. And now everything is in one kind of long continuous strip. And for some purposes, that could be more useful. All right, so that is my first of my top 10 list, just the basic navigation tools. There's other ones you would want to know about. Under View, there's both the navigator and the timeline. The timeline is kind of cool. It shows you where the tempo changes are, and you can just go straight to your score, to different places in your score that way. It shows you where rehearsal marks are. You can jump from rehearsal mark to rehearsal mark and so forth. Shows you where double bar lines are and so forth. So that is another great tool for moving around in your score. All right, so that's a really important thing, navigation, that I see people struggle with until they figure this out. The next one I want to talk about is related, and it's the idea of selecting things. So I'm going to go back to full-size view. And by the way, I got this sort of shrunk view by using the drop down here. If you have a touchpad, I'm doing that, right? The whatever you call that gesture, pinch. I think on my touch screen I can also use pinch gestures. Yeah, I can. And also Control 0, or for Mac users, I believe Command 0, will just set kind of the default size. All right, so I've got the default size here. Now I want to select things. Let's say I want to select these measures right here. Okay, that's nice. I want to select these measures here. So often people discover that if you try to drag select, you drag your score. Maybe that's how people discover that works. Eventually you might discover that Shift plus drag will draw a rectangle that allows you to select things, and that can sometimes be useful, but it's not always the most efficient way of doing things. Usually most programs, and MuseScore is no exception, support some specific shortcuts for selection that you want to know about. So if I click in an empty measure, that selects that measure. If I shift click over here, it's going to select everything in that range. Shift click. And this again isn't unique to MuseScore. I should show you that if I'm typing some let's go here, type some text, I'm gonna click here, shift click here, right? So it's the same thing that you see in pretty much any program, that click something, shift click something else will select everything between those two extremes. And it also works across staves. So if I click this and then shift click down here, it's going to select those two measures across all of those staves. So clicking something, shift clicking something else. The other thing that again MuseScore didn't invent, and I'm just going to use the chat window as another place to do things, is the idea of using shift while using the cursor keys. So if I click over here, and then I'm going to press shift and right arrow, shift right, and notice one letter at a time is selecting. Control right arrow with shift selects a word at a time. Well, it's the same in MuseScore. If I click something and shift right arrow, it will extend one note at a time, which is kind of like one letter at a time. Shift left arrow goes the other way. Or if I add control, it goes a whole measure at a time. So a whole measure at a time. Sometimes a whole measure is a note, so maybe that wasn't the best place to, here, let me do it here so you can see a little more clearly. So just shift right goes a note at a time, but shift control right goes a measure at a time. So those are some ways of making selections in MuseScore. And then also, if you want to select all the way to the end of the score, shift control end. Shift control end. I guess my I have to use that end key there. Shift control end. We'll select everything to the end of the score, or shift control home to select to the beginning of the score. So control home goes to the beginning, control end goes to the end. So shift while using any of those cursor keys, including home and end, or page up and page down for that matter, will select as you move, as it moves the cursor. The other thing you might want to know about selection is that you can select similar elements. Like if I want to select all the lyrics in the soprano part here, I can right-click one of these. So that's actually my third trick, which is probably something that Mac users in particular need to know about, because they're the ones who are the least likely to have encountered this before, because most Mac mice only have one button, and so a lot of Mac programs don't really have a concept of right-clicking. But some of them do, and on a Mac, right-click is control-click. Or if you have a touchpad, it's two-finger tap usually, and that's how it is for me also. Again, I don't have a physical mouse. Two-finger tap is a right-click. And when you right-click something in MuseScore, you get a menu that's specific to that type of element. So when I right-click the lyric, I get things that are relevant to lyrics. If I right-click a note, I'm getting something that's specific to notes, and so forth. If I right-click a dynamic, I get a menu that's specific to dynamics. I mean, some of the things like cut, copy, and paste are the same. So if I want to select all my lyrics, I can right-click one lyric, and then select is one of the things on this menu, and then I can say all similar elements, or all similar elements in the same staff, which is what I wanted here. And now it's selected all the soprano lyrics, and then I can delete them or do whatever else I might want to do with them. So that's something you can do. And you also notice that one of those options maybe was select all similar elements in range selection. So if I first select a few measures, like from here to here, and then I right-click a lyric, select all similar elements in range selection, it'll just select those lyrics there that were in that range selection. So those are some ways of making selections, and right-clicking is a thing to know about. There's a number of things in MuseScore that are accessible most easily through right-click. There's only a few things that are only in the right-click. It used to be that there were more things that were only in right-click. Most of those things have now moved to the inspector. So there's very few things now that are only in the right-click menu. Anyone want to guess at what some of the, if you want to challenge yourself, think about what some of those things are that are only in the right-click and leave them in the comments, because actually right now, something to do with lines, no voltas, no, those have all moved there. I'm sure there's something that's only, well, that particular function, that select all similar, is certainly that way, but there might be some settings also that you can only get to from right-click, but I'm not thinking what they are at the moment. All right, so I've covered three of my top things. I've covered navigation, I've covered selection, and right-clicking. Number 4 on my list is note input, and just the basic idea that yes, you can use the mouse to enter notes, and we all eventually figure that out, that if I click here and then click here, well, maybe you eventually figure out that you have to be in note input mode. And of course, the tours that show up when you first start MuseScore now with MuseScore 3 are helpful because they explain a lot of these things. But once I'm in note input mode, yes, I can click the half note, I can click here to enter notes. But this is not the most efficient way to do it. I highly, highly, highly encourage you, even if you don't use keyboard shortcuts for other things, to get used to them for note input. It will speed things up tremendously. So the shortcuts for eighth, quarter and half are 4, 5, and 6. If you have a numeric keypad, that's like the middle row. 4, 5, 6 for eighth, quarter, half, and then type letter names. So if I want a quarter note E, it'll be 5E. And then I can type F, G, A, and now maybe I want some eighth notes. 4 will change to eighth notes, and I can go B, A, G, F, E. So entering notes using the keyboard shortcuts is hugely time saving. And if I want to enter a B right now and I want it to be this B up here, if I just type a B, it's actually going to enter that B, which isn't the one I wanted. Control up will change the octave. Control up changes octave. Without control, it goes up in half steps and down in half steps. So getting used to using the keyboard shortcuts for note input is going to really save you a lot of time if you're used to using the mouse for all of that. There's also something you might find useful. If I press the P key, you get a piano keyboard. If you can't remember P for piano, it's under the View menu, View, Piano Keyboard. And now I can just enter notes by clicking them. And then I can use the keyboard shortcuts like change to half note by pressing 6 and then click the notes. So if you're more comfortable entering notes using a keyboard, but you don't have an actual MIDI keyboard connected, because that works too, you can use this piano keyboard. So that is my fourth tip. Get used to those keyboard shortcuts for entering notes. There's other ones, there's shortcuts for entering tuplet. Oh, I need to tell you rests, 0. So I said that typing a G gives you a G. If you want to enter a rest, the shortcut is 0. So if I want to enter a quarter rest here, 5 to go to quarter, and then 0 to enter a rest. So 0 is the shortcut. It's like just a letter. Think about it. Think about this is a G, that's an F, that's an E, that's a 0. That's the way to think about it. 0 is just the shortcut for rest. So there's a lot of shortcuts I mentioned. Tuplets can be done with shortcuts. The up and down arrows to add accidentals. Ties can be entered with a shortcut. It's plus. You can learn all the shortcuts. But just getting used to the basics of using the numbers for durations and letters for note names really can save you a lot of time. Okay, the next thing, good. The P piano keyboard is indeed nice. If you're going to use that, you should know, like when I go to enter an accidental, let me come back to the piano keyboard. If I enter this note here, is this going to be a G sharp or an A flat? Well, apparently it's a G sharp. What if I wanted it to be spelled A flat? The J key changes the spelling of a note. So J flips it back and forth between G sharp and A flat. So if you use the piano keyboard, you enter an accidental, but you didn't want to spell it that way, the J key will change it to the other spelling. And this even works for things like B. If you press J here, it'll happily change it to C flat and A double sharp. And then back to B. Okay, so that's the getting notes into your score. I now want to talk about entering other things into your score. So tip number 5 has to do with the palettes, and it's a very simple one. I'm going to press P again to get rid of the piano keyboard because I don't need it. Right now, I am in what's called the advanced workspace. So I have a lot of palettes, and if I open them up, I have a lot of symbols. Oops. Actually, that's not one of the bigger ones. This is one of the bigger ones. By default, though, depending on how you answered the question when you first start MuseScore, it asks you some questions in MuseScore 3. The default is the basic palette. Well, the basic workspace. The basic workspace doesn't have as many palettes. It's missing some of them. Like it's missing that one that I tried to open a minute ago that says arpeggios and glissandi, or glissandos, I can't remember how it's worded. That palette is just missing because it figures that's sort of an advanced feature that maybe some people don't want to be confused with. Also, if I open the articulations palette, you see there's only a handful in there. So the basic workspace has limited selections here. And I think maybe the time signatures palette might also be more limited, although I'm not sure. So if you're looking for a symbol and having trouble finding it, switch to the advanced workspace. You notice there's also a couple others here. You can create your own workspaces using this plus button here and customize your workspaces. You can add your own elements into the palettes and things. That's kind of an advanced technique. That's one I will happily point you to the manual for, or to my online course in the customization lessons to learn about customizations. But just to get from the basic to the advanced workspace, that's usually the very, very, very first thing I recommend people do if they're going to be doing much with MuseScore, is switch to the advanced workspace and just stay there. Because now you get these additional palettes, and the palettes that are even the same will, between the two workspaces, will have more symbols on them, so you don't have to wonder, well, how do I get this symbol, how do I get this symbol? There's just more of them there to find. So that's a useful thing. There's also a palette that doesn't show up over here. There's a hidden palette that a lot of people don't know about called the Symbols palette, and the way you get that is by pressing Z, the shortcut Z. Whoa, oh, I'm in the palette search mode here. I didn't mean to do that. There's a search box here, and this allows you to hunt for different symbols. Like if I type nothing shows up when I type forte. Okay, I started to type dynamics, and now I see all my dynamics. What is it? I guess it's F. It's not called forte, it's just called F. So if I type F into my search box, I will probably find that, although it's not showing up. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with how all the search features work in here, but it's going to find different, it's a way of finding symbols in the palettes also. So anyhow, what was I doing? Oh, I want to type Z. So I need to click back in the score, type Z, and now I'm going to get this. This is the Symbols palette. Now you can also get that, let me hit escape to get out of there. If you go to View, Master Palette, and then it's got all of these palettes along the side, the very last one that says Symbols. And when you click the word Symbols, you'll see it expands because it gives you all these different categories of symbols, and there are thousands of them. These are pictograms for symbols that are used in drumline music. Here's some figured bass symbols, some supplementary symbols to use, and other symbols to use in figured bass specifically. Kodai hand signals, if you're doing that sort of thing. That's the do, re, mi stuff. So there's all sorts of crazy symbols in here. These are different symbols that you'd use for violin to indicate different plucking techniques. I think I'm thinking of these as violin because I see the pizzicato ones, but probably guitar uses some of these same ones, like the strum up and down. So there's just thousands upon thousands of symbols in here. There's symbols for different types of microtonal accidentals, just all sorts of crazy things. And again, you can search to find these things. So if you want to find all the different accidentals, type accident. I can just type the beginning of it. Oops. Oh, that's only showing me the accidentals in the section that I'm in. So if I want to search all of the symbols, I can go back and click Symbols. And now when I type accidentals, well, again, it's not showing me the accidentals because I guess they're actually listed individually. So if I want to see the sharps, I type sharp. And now I can see all the different symbols that have anything to do with sharp and so forth. So that Symbols palette. So switch to the advanced workspace, and then also know some symbols are only in that Symbols palette. Okay, so that's something about adding symbols to your score, but that's just finding the symbols. The next tip I want to give you is about actually adding symbols to your score. So now that, say you found some symbol you want to add, like say under the Lines palette, you found that you want a first ending. A lot of people figure out that you can drag that into your score, but that's slow and a little bit inaccurate. It's a little sometimes hard to find exactly the right spot to drop to. You may notice, let me undo that. Oh, undo, Control Z is a standard shortcut, Command Z for Mac. While I'm dragging it, it's like showing me all these different places it might attach to, and you have to make sure you drop it on the right place. Some symbols, when you go to drag them, are going to basically, until you, like, let me try dragging some text. this is just saying, no, can't drag here, can't drag here, can't drag here. You can't drag until you're right on top of the note. Then you can release. So sometimes just getting something to drag and drop onto your score is like more awkward than it needs to be. And so you don't have to do that. Let me undo both of those things. Instead of dragging and dropping, I want to encourage you to use double click. So if I want to add a text to this note, I click it and then I double click the element. The nice thing about that is it works for entire selections. Like if I want all of those notes to be staccato, I can go to the articulations palette, double click the staccato, and now they're all staccato rather than drag and drop to each note individually. So that is a useful technique. And then also that works for lines. If I want my first ending to be 2 measures long, I can select those 2 measures, double click my first ending, and it's automatically applied to both measures. So select something, then double click in the palette. That is usually the most efficient way to add things. So that was I guess tip number 6, is to add things from the palette, select it in the score, then double click it in the palette. It works for virtually everything in there. So on to number 7. When it comes to lines, if you have added a line and maybe you added it by drag and drop and then you decided, you know what, I need it to be 1 more measure. How do you make this longer? Well, a lot of people figure out that if you double click it, then you can drag this handle. But notice that dotted line is telling me it's still attached to that other bar line. What this means is, as far as playback is concerned, this isn't really a 3 measure long first ending. It's really a 2 measure long first ending that's been dragged to be longer than it looks, or look longer than it really is. And there'll be no way to get it to move on to the next system this way. Dragging is not the way to extend a line like a volta. So let me undo that drag. Instead, I'm going to double click it and I'm going to press Shift Right. Shift Right extends the volta a measure at a time. And the same for other lines, whether they're the crescendo lines or pedal lines or octave lines. All these lines, Shift Right and then Shift Left to shrink it. And so for voltas, that goes a measure at a time. For other things, like for if I add a crescendo, say, I'm going to drag and drop it here. And maybe I didn't really want it all 3 notes. If I double click it, I can use Shift Left to go a note at a time, or Shift Right to go a note at a time. So to extend lines, Shift Left, Shift Right is how you extend them, but it's usually more efficient just to select the range you want right away. So if you know you want a crescendo to go from here to here, just select it, and then you can double click the crescendo. Now, some of you may also know that there's a shortcut for the crescendo. So if I undo that, this time I'm going to add it by selecting and using the shortcut. The shortcut is the less than sign because it looks like a crescendo. So when I press that, it adds the crescendo for me. Shift S is a shortcut for staccato. There's shortcuts for a number of symbols in the palettes, but by no means all of them. So that's something else you can pour through the documentation to learn about. In fact, maybe I'll let me go to my website for a second here and post a link to my shortcuts document, because I have a nice. I need to update it from MuseScore 3. Not a ton has changed, but just enough has that I need to update it, and I'm still working on updating things from MuseScore 3. So this is my document, my cheat sheet for shortcuts. Let me show you what it looks like. It looks like this. And then you can print this thing out and fold it and get a nice little booklet full of shortcuts. And again, this is MuseScore 2, but not a ton has changed from MuseScore 3. So let me go back to my chat window. Oops, I don't need to have all that in there. Okay, so that's how to add things from the palette. double click is your friend, shortcuts are your friend. That's how you extend lines. So that extending line was actually my tip number 7. Yeah. So I got 3 more here. I thought I had 10 of them. Number 8 has to do with text specifically. And this one is one of the few here that might blow some people's minds, even if you're experienced, because this one is brand new. It only came out in 3.0.2, like 2 weeks ago. So let's say that I want to add lyrics. Let me get rid of that because that's in my way. You may know the shortcut for lyrics is Control L. And then I can type some letters like A, and then press space, lit, and then hyphen, and little boy. I don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just random things. A, B. I'm typing space, and it's moving on to the next note. So you've probably all realized that lyrics work that way, and that chord symbols work that way. Let me delete all these now. Well, as of 3.0.2, other text now works this way too. In particular, fingering works this way. So if I add a fingering, and by the way, you can have a shortcut. There's no default shortcut for fingering, but you can customize one under Edit, Preferences, Shortcuts. There's all these shortcuts for things that you can customize. And so if you type in fingering in here, you'll see there's the ability to create a shortcut for add fingering. You do that by saying define, and I already did it on my system, so Control Alt F will do it. So now look at what happens when I enter a fingering. If I click here, Control Alt F, now I can enter a fingering, and I'm going to press space. This is terrible fingering, but it's fingering. Anyhow, space will do the same thing for fingering now that it has always done for lyrics, and this feature is all of 2 weeks old. So that as a way of entering fingers, and even if you don't have a shortcut defined, or maybe you're using guitar fingering, which doesn't have a shortcut, these are for guitar, these are for piano here, these numbers here, and they will show up above the notes. And by the way, also, I think you may have seen this before, it now works where if I have 2 fingerings on the same note, they will stack above, which also is a new feature for 3.0.2, as opposed to showing up on the sides. But for guitar, it's correct to show up on the side. So these are the left-hand guitar fingerings over here. So if I add one of those fingerings and I want to add more, well, I could just double-click that one to put it in edit mode, and now press space, and again, it will let me add my fingerings note by note. So fingerings, pressing space will now do that. So that's great for fingerings, but it also works for other kinds of text. So let me delete all those fingerings, select all similar, delete. Now I'm going to enter a staff text here. Control T is the shortcut for staff text. And I'll say text. Now if I press space, it's just going to enter space because, of course, I might be entering spaces within my text. But there's a shortcut, Alt right, and I'm going to press Alt and right. That is going to do the same basic thing of moving to the next note, letting me enter some text, and then Alt right, enter some more. Alt right, enter some more. Alt left will go backwards. Shift space moves backwards, by the way, also when you're entering lyrics. So this is a new thing for adding text. And it lets you enter staff text every every note like this, in the same way you could enter notes or enter lyrics or chord symbols. So that is a new feature in 3.0.2 that you may find very useful, and that would allow you to enter these different kinds of texts. You should also know that most of these texts in the text palettes have shortcuts. This is Control T, that's Control E. Rehearsal marks, Control M, and so forth. Actually, these don't have shortcuts, but those do. So adding text and then being able to just use Alt left and Alt left and Alt right to move note by note to add more text is a new feature that you may find useful. All right, so that's some stuff about entering text, and then again for fingering, space and shift space moving left, and Alt left and Alt right work fingerings also, but so does space, which is probably more natural. Okay, so that's tip number 8, and now that's I've talked about moving around in your score, selecting things in your score, adding things to your score. The last two tips have to do with changing things in your score, making manual adjustments. So you've probably already figured out that if you click something and then drag it, you can change its position. And auto place does this nice thing of avoiding collision. So if I move this under here, the other thing moves up. So dragging works, but it's not very precise. If I want to make several things like all aligned, are those all aligned? No, not really. So let me undo all that. If you want to move things more precisely, yeah, I guess I moved. Oh, so let me right click, select all similar, Control R resets to the default position. Okay, so if I want to move things more precisely, I can use the arrow keys. The up arrow, or up arrow moves in tiny little increments. Control up moves a staff space at a time, and that's what I usually use because the small increments are, it's like, if I have to move it that small of amount, it's barely worth it. If I want to move it, it's because I want to move it. So I tend to use control up, control down a lot. There's also a bug where up, down by themselves, those adjustments won't get saved. I've already got a fix submitted for it. Hopefully it'll be in the next update. But left and right also. And then control left, control left moves a staff space at a time. And so for text, you just do it that way. For other things, for articulations, I believe also you can just move them individually. For some other symbols, it's not necessarily just, like, let me think, what other symbols would I need to do this with? Let me add an ornament. I'm going to drag and drop for some reason. So ornaments, yeah, I guess that works too. For some symbols, anyhow, you have to double click them before the arrow keys become, like for instance, can I do that with this? I don't think I can. Yeah, I can. So I double clicked the time signature, and now I can move it also, right? So some symbols have that idea we have to double click them, or a tremolo symbol. Let me add a tremolo to this note, and I will double click to add the tremolo. Now if I double click the tremolo symbol itself, I can now use the arrow keys to fine tune the position of it. So double click arrow keys. So that's a way of moving things kind of in a more precise way. And why is that useful? When we reset this, if I want to move everything up 3 clicks, I can click this guy and go control up, control up, control up. Now do this, control up, control up, control up. And now I know they're aligned. Do this, control up, control up, control up. Now I know these 3 are aligned. Let me undo those changes. Well, yeah, I'll just keep undoing. I could also select them. Oh, I didn't mention control click. Control click for selection kind of lets you select things individually. So, and then control click will either add it to the selection or remove it from the selection. So these 3 are selected now. I can use the inspector, and right now -2 is their offset. So the inspector works a little funny. I want to make this a bigger negative number. This is telling me how far from the staff line. Positive numbers are down, negative numbers are up. So I want this to be a bigger negative number. I want this to be like -5. So I want this to be basically a smaller number. So I'm going to click this little arrow here. I'm missing the arrow. There we go. And notice now that it's moving everything together. So the inspector lets you do that. You can also just click in here and use the arrow keys, which again work kind of backwards because up arrow goes to a bigger number, which basically moves things down. And it won't let you collide with the staff. Auto placement prevents that. If you really want to move your text onto the staff, disable auto placement. Now you can move that text all the way onto the staff if you want. But normally you don't need to disable auto placement unless you want collisions. So the cursor keys to adjust things, or using the inspector to adjust things. That's the next thing that I wanted to show you. Let me come back here. All right, I have one last tip that I intended to do. I said I had a top 10 list, and that was number 9. That was for moving things. I like the cursor keys. I like the inspector. But if you want to move that text below the staff, yes, I could disable auto placement and then just move it all the way below. I can do a lot better than that. I have that text selected. Let me do it again. I'm going to select this text. X. Boom. It just flips it below. X. Let me reset the positions of this so I remove all those manual adjustments and do it again. X moves below. Because those manual adjustments it was trying to apply there and it didn't look so hot. So with no manual adjustments, I did the Control R to reset them. The text is at a reasonable distance above. Now it's a reasonable distance below. And this works not just for text, it works for most things. It works, for instance, for these staccato dots. Click one, X, flips it. I think it'll work for the trill, but I don't. Yes, it works for the trill. It even works for the volta, even though it's a little funny there. No, it doesn't work for the volta. But for the things it doesn't work for, sometimes there's a setting in the inspector, placement, above to below. And so I have it set to below, and it's not working because that's actually the text. I'm lying. That's not about the line itself. So for voltas, I guess we don't support the flipping because it's going to look wrong anyhow. So I lied about that. But it does work if I enter a hairpin, for instance. There's a different line. If I click that and come down here, and then I find my placement, flip it to above. So for the things that X doesn't work for, come over here to the inspector and you'll see placement above, below. And then there's a reset button there to put it back. Also, anytime you make a change like that, if you want to make that the new default above, if you want to make all your crescendos above, hit the Set as Style button. Now that is the new style, and now all crescendos that I enter will default to being above the staff. So there's an extra little tip for you. So that's my top 10 list. These are the things that I find that people who are just finding their way around MuseScore through trial and error, you can learn a lot that way. We've tried to make the interface as intuitive as you can given how powerful it is, but there's some things that we know people aren't going to figure out on their own. We encourage you, read the handbook. I encourage you, sign up for my online course. But there's a lot you can figure out on your own because it really is designed to be reasonably intuitive, especially if you've used other notation software, and so some of the concepts are similar, particularly Sibelius, because I think we're probably more similar to Sibelius than we are to Finale or Dorico. Anyhow, these are some of the things that I find people who have been using MuseScore for a while, but sort of doing it through trial and error. These are the things that I find they're usually getting wrong, or at least not taking the full advantage of what MuseScore can do. So I hope you found this useful. If you have your own favorite tips and tricks that you'd like to also see me talk about, feel free to add these in the comments here. But this is my top 10 list, and I think at some point I'm going to do a really streamlined presentation of this and put it on the website. But you guys got to be kind of my guinea pigs for this. As I said, I've been kind of developing this list over the course of several presentations I've given over the last few months. So with that, I think I'm going to sign off, and you're welcome. And I'm going to sign off, and I'm not sure what I'm talking about next week. I'm also game for suggestions. One of the things I'm always thinking I would probably want to spend more time talking about, just because it's such a big topic, is automatic placement in MuseScore 3. It's an amazingly cool feature, but if you don't really understand how it's working for you, it can be frustrating at first, especially if you have scores that you created in MuseScore 2 and made a lot of manual adjustments on. So anyhow, I'll probably at some time do a whole cafe just dedicated to automatic placement and showing you how to get the most use out of it and how to make it work for you, not against you. I don't know if that's going to be next week or if it's going to be sometime down the road. I'm always up for suggestions of topics you want to hear about. So feel free to just drop me comments, send me email, Marc at MuseScore, Marc with a C, at musescore.com, and I will see you next time. So thanks.